The small town sat quiet under the pale winter sky, the kind of quiet that settles over a community when something unspeakable has happened, and time has done nothing to heal the wound. For nearly 3 decades, the people of this Oklahoma community carried the weight of an unsolved tragedy, a crime so brutal and senseless that it became woven into the fabric of their collective memory. The victim was a young woman full of promise, a dancer with dreams that extended far beyond the borders of the state, and her death in the winter of 1996 left a scar that never quite faded. Families locked their doors a little tighter after that December, parents held their children closer, and an entire generation grew up knowing that evil had visited their town and walked away unpunished. The case files gathered dust in the police department, the evidence sat sealed in bags, and the photographs of the crime scene remained tucked away in boxes that few had the stomach to revisit. But justice, though delayed, has a way of circling back when least expected, and when the news broke that an arrest had been made, the shockwaves rippled through every street, every coffee shop, every church pew in town. The victim had been a student at the local university, a place where young people came to build futures and chase ambitions. She studied dance, dedicating her body and spirit to an art form that demanded everything and promised nothing certain in return. Friends remembered her as someone who moved through the world with grace, not just in her physical presence but in the way she treated others. She had completed her final semester and was preparing to return home to her family for the holidays, planning to pursue a graduate degree in teaching and share her love of dance with future students. On the night before her disappearance, she gathered with friends to exchange Christmas gifts and say goodbye before the winter break. She spent that last evening laughing and making plans for the future, unaware that her time was measured in hours. The next morning, she drove a friend to the airport and returned to her apartment to finish packing. It was still early, the sun barely up, when neighbors heard the scream. 3 witnesses would later come forward to describe what they heard that morning, and their accounts painted a picture of terror in those final moments. One was a police officer who worked security at the apartment complex, off-duty but alert, who heard a woman scream in a way that suggested mortal fear. Another neighbor living across the parking lot heard not only the scream but also a male voice, harsh and commanding, ordering someone to shut up and get in a car. A police report was filed. An officer responded to the scene, but nothing appeared out of place at the time. By the time the sun was fully up, the young dancer was gone, her car missing from the lot, her apartment empty and silent. Hours passed with no word, and concern grew among her friends and family. Her parents were supposed to arrive that day to bring her home, and when they could not reach her, the dread began to set in. A close friend who had planned to meet her for lunch arrived at her apartment around midday and found her car missing. He returned later in the afternoon, still no sign of her, and by then he knew something was terribly wrong. He contacted his grandparents, searched the places she might have gone, even drove to the airport, but there was no trace. Together with his grandfather, he filed a missing persons report with the university police, and the search began in earnest. That same afternoon, miles away from the apartment complex, a fisherman noticed something strange along the shoreline of a local lake. He left the area but could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, so after dark he returned with his wife to investigate further. What they found was the body of a young woman, discarded like refuse near the water's edge. The police were called, and when they arrived, they quickly connected the discovery to the missing persons report filed earlier that day. The identification was made, and the worst fears of everyone who loved her were confirmed. An autopsy revealed the cause of death to be a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, the bullet traveling through her brain and lodging in the front of her skull. The medical examiner also found evidence of sexual assault, both vaginal and anal, and bruising on her face and body that told a story of violence and suffering in her final hours. The crime scene was processed with meticulous care, every piece of evidence cataloged and preserved. But in those early days, there were no clear leads, no obvious suspects, and no immediate answers for a community desperate to understand how such a thing could happen. The investigation began in earnest, but the trail was cold from the start. Detectives interviewed friends, family, acquaintances, anyone who might have seen or heard something useful, but the pieces did not fit together in any coherent way. The evidence collected from the scene included clothing, bodily fluids, and other trace materials that could potentially identify the killer. But forensic technology in the mid-90s was not what it would become in later years. DNA profiling existed, but databases were limited, and without a suspect to compare the evidence against, the investigation stalled. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case began to recede from the headlines even as it remained a burning question in the hearts of those who knew her. Her family held a funeral attended by hundreds of mourners, fellow students and faculty members who remembered her kindness and talent, and the university established a scholarship in her name to honor her memory and ensure that her passion for dance would live on in others. But as the years passed without resolution, the hope for justice began to fade, and the case became one of those grim statistics, an unsolved murder that haunted a community but seemed destined to remain a mystery forever. 4 years after the murder, the district attorney made a bold and unusual move. In an effort to keep the case alive and preserve the ability to prosecute the killer if he were ever identified, the prosecution filed formal charges against an unknown suspect, a person referred to in the legal documents as John Doe. The charges included murder, rape, forcible sodomy, and kidnapping, and they were based on the DNA profile extracted from the evidence collected at the crime scene. This was a strategic decision, a way to work around the statute of limitations on sexual offenses, which would have expired 7 years after the crime. By filing the charges early and using the DNA profile as the identifying factor, the prosecution ensured that even if the killer remained at large for years or even decades, he could still be brought to justice when technology or luck finally caught up with him. The police released a composite sketch of the suspected killer based on witness descriptions and forensic analysis, describing him as a white male in his early 20s, with light brown collar-length hair, medium complexion, and a height and weight that fit a general build. The sketch was circulated, tips came in, and several individuals were investigated as potential suspects over the following years. The first suspect was a homeless man who resembled the composite sketch and was in custody on a minor charge. He was questioned, his background examined, but thorough investigation and DNA testing ruled him out completely. Another suspect emerged when an anonymous tip pointed to a young man facing charges for drunk driving and bail jumping. He too was investigated, his DNA tested, and he was cleared when the results showed no match. Twin brothers and their father were brought in for questioning after a tip suggested they might be involved, but again, DNA evidence exonerated them. A man facing rape charges and a history of attempted abductions was also considered, but the DNA told the same story, no match. Another suspect was a man living in California who had relocated from Oklahoma shortly after the murder, which seemed suspicious, but once again the DNA evidence cleared him. Each false lead was a dead end. Each cleared suspect a reminder that the real killer was still out there, and the frustration among investigators and the victim's family grew with each passing year. The case file remained open, the evidence preserved, but hope was fading that the killer would ever be caught. Then in the summer of 2004, 8 years after the murder, the breakthrough came. Advances in forensic technology and the expansion of DNA databases meant that law enforcement could now compare the evidence from unsolved crimes against the genetic profiles of individuals who had been arrested and convicted of other offenses. One such individual was a young man serving time in an Oklahoma prison for burglary. He had submitted a DNA sample as part of the routine processing of convicted criminals, and when that sample was run through the system, it came back as a match to the DNA profile from the 1996 murder. The match was not close, it was exact, and the odds of it being anyone else were astronomical, in the trillions to one. The man in question was 25 years old at the time of the breakthrough, which meant he had been just 18 when the murder occurred. His name had never come up in the original investigation, and there was no obvious connection between him and the victim, but the science was irrefutable. He was formally charged in the fall of 2004, the John Doe indictment amended to include his name, and the prosecution announced their intention to seek the death penalty. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. For 8 years, people had lived with the knowledge that a killer was among them, possibly someone they knew, possibly someone they passed on the street without a second thought. The revelation that the murderer was a young man with a criminal record, someone who had been in and out of the legal system for years, was both a relief and a source of anger. How had he evaded suspicion for so long? Why had it taken 8 years to connect the dots? The answers lay in the limitations of technology and the randomness of database matches, but that did little to soothe the frustration. Background checks revealed that the suspect had a history of run-ins with the law, including charges for escaping a halfway house, hiding stolen property, pointing a firearm, and burglary. He had also been implicated in another murder from the year before the dancer's death, though a cousin had been convicted of that crime and insisted the suspect was not involved. There were also allegations of sexual assault against a former girlfriend, though those charges had been resolved through a plea deal. This was not a model citizen, but neither was he someone who had been on the radar as a potential suspect in the dancer's murder. His arrest brought a mixture of emotions to the surface: relief that the killer had finally been identified, anger that it had taken so long, and a deep sadness that no amount of justice could bring back the young woman whose life had been stolen. The trial began in early 2006, nearly 10 years after the crime. The prosecution built their case on multiple pillars of evidence, starting with the DNA match that had led to the arrest. Forensic experts testified that the DNA found on the victim's clothing and body was a match to the defendant, and the statistical probability of it belonging to someone else was so remote as to be essentially impossible. But the DNA was not the only evidence. Witnesses came forward to describe what they had seen on the day of the murder. One woman testified that she had seen the victim's car, a small red vehicle with out-of-state license plates, being driven by a man with a female passenger who looked terrified. The witness described the male driver as having cold, angry eyes, and the frightened expression on the female passenger's face had stuck with her for years. Another witness testified that he had seen the same car being driven by a lone male, and he had followed it for a distance before the driver parked and walked away. Ballistics evidence was introduced showing that a bullet found in the victim's skull was consistent with ammunition found in the defendant's home, suggesting that the murder weapon had been in his possession. A forensic expert testified that shoe prints found at the crime scene matched a type of athletic shoe that the defendant was known to wear, based on testimony from a woman who had lived with him during the time of the murder. Perhaps most damning was the evidence related to the victim's missing cell phone. After her death, the phone had continued to be used, and records showed that it had been used to call several individuals, all of whom were acquainted with the defendant. This suggested that the killer had taken the phone from the victim and either used it himself or given it to someone in his circle. The prosecution painted a picture of a brutal, premeditated crime, an abduction followed by sexual assault and murder, carried out by a young man who showed no mercy and left behind a trail of evidence that would eventually lead to his capture. The defense tried to argue that the blood and DNA samples taken from the defendant after his arrest were illegal, claiming a violation of privacy, but the judge ruled that the evidence was admissible. The jury heard all the testimony, reviewed all the evidence, and after deliberating, they returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, rape, and sodomy. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally intense. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, presenting the crime as an act of extreme cruelty and depravity, and calling the defendant a heartless executioner who had shown no compassion to his victim. The defense pleaded for mercy, arguing that a life sentence would be more appropriate and that executing the defendant would eliminate any possibility of redemption. The district attorney countered by pointing out that the victim had been shown no mercy, no compassion, no chance for redemption, and that the defendant deserved the same fate he had inflicted on her. The jury deliberated and recommended the death penalty, and the judge formally imposed the sentence, along with additional prison terms for the rape and sodomy convictions. The defendant was sent to death row, where he would remain for the next 17 years as his case wound through the appeals process. The appeals were lengthy and complex, as is often the case in capital punishment cases. The defendant's legal team challenged the conviction on multiple grounds, arguing procedural errors, questioning the admissibility of evidence, and raising constitutional concerns about the death penalty itself. Each appeal was reviewed by higher courts, and each time the conviction and sentence were upheld. The state appellate court rejected the direct appeal, the federal courts declined to intervene, and even the United States Supreme Court refused to hear the case, effectively exhausting all available legal remedies. For years, the defendant remained on death row, maintaining his innocence and claiming that the real killer was someone else, specifically his own father. This claim emerged in the final years before his scheduled execution, with testimony from a woman who had been in a relationship with the defendant's father, stating that the father had confessed to the murder. The defense argued that the father, who had since died, was the true killer and that the DNA evidence could be explained by familial connection. But the prosecution dismissed this as a desperate ploy, pointing out that reverse paternity tests confirmed that the DNA at the scene belonged to the defendant, not his father, and that the statistical evidence was overwhelming. The courts agreed and the final appeals were denied. The execution was scheduled for a morning in late summer, and as the date approached, the defendant made one last attempt to delay it, arguing that his new legal team needed more time to review the case. The state attorney general opposed the request, calling the defendant's claims ludicrous and reiterating the strength of the DNA evidence. On the morning of the execution, about 30 minutes before the procedure was set to begin, the United States Supreme Court issued a final ruling, denying the stay of execution and allowing the process to move forward. Less than an hour later, the defendant was led into the execution chamber, where he was strapped to a gurney and given the opportunity to make a final statement. He continued to proclaim his innocence, criticized his former lawyers, and thanked those who had supported him. Then the lethal injection was administered, a 3-drug cocktail that stopped his heart and ended his life. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward, and the long chapter of this case finally came to a close. The reaction in the community was mixed. For some, the execution brought a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had finally been served after nearly 3 decades of waiting. The victim's family, though they did not attend the execution, expressed through intermediaries that they were at peace with the outcome. The state attorney general, who witnessed the execution, spoke publicly about the importance of holding the defendant accountable and hoped that the resolution would bring some measure of peace to those who had been affected by the crime. But for others, the execution was a somber reminder of the violence that had taken place all those years ago, and the knowledge that no amount of punishment could undo the harm that had been done. The victim was still gone, her dreams still unfulfilled, her life still cut short in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. In the years since the murder, the victim had not been forgotten. The university where she studied continued to honor her memory through the scholarship established in her name, awarded annually to a dance student who embodied the same passion and dedication that she had shown. Former classmates and professors spoke of her with warmth, remembering her talent and the joy she brought to those around her. The police chief who had responded to the missing persons report all those years ago reflected on the case in interviews, describing the victim as a young woman with a brilliant future who had been taken far too soon. The district attorney who prosecuted the case recalled the trial and the emotional weight of sitting across from the victim's parents as they heard the details of their daughter's final hours. These memories kept her spirit alive, even as the legal process ground forward toward its inevitable conclusion. The arrest and conviction also served as a reminder of the power of forensic science and the importance of preserving evidence, even in cases that seem impossible to solve. In the mid-90s, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, and the idea of using a genetic profile to identify a suspect years after a crime was not yet common practice. But the detectives and prosecutors who worked the case had the foresight to preserve the evidence carefully, knowing that advances in science might one day make it possible to identify the killer. That decision proved to be critical, and when the DNA databases expanded and the suspect's profile was entered into the system, the match was made almost immediately. It was a testament to patience, to persistence, and to the belief that even the coldest cases could be solved with the right tools and the right timing. The case also highlighted the randomness of justice and the role that chance plays in solving crimes. The suspect was not caught because of brilliant detective work or a dramatic confession. He was caught because he committed another crime years later, was arrested, and was required to submit a DNA sample as part of his sentence. Had he not been caught for burglary, had he not been required to give a sample, the murder might have remained unsolved indefinitely. This element of chance is both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that justice sometimes depends on luck as much as skill. But whatever the circumstances, the result was the same. The killer was identified, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed, and the community that had lived in the shadow of this crime for so long could finally begin to move forward. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest, the community experienced a wave of emotions that ranged from relief to disbelief. People who had grown up hearing about the case, who had internalized the fear and uncertainty that came with an unsolved murder, suddenly had answers. The killer had a name, a face, a history. He was not a phantom or a boogeyman but a real person who had lived among them, who had walked the same streets and breathed the same air. For some, this was reassuring, proof that the system could work and that evil could be brought to account. For others, it was disturbing, a reminder of how easily someone capable of such violence could blend into society and avoid detection for years. The news coverage was extensive, with local and national media outlets picking up the story and running features on the case, the victim, and the long road to justice. Reporters interviewed neighbors, friends, and legal experts, all trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for the community going forward. The trial itself became a focal point for the community, a public reckoning with the crime and its impact. The courtroom was filled with spectators, many of them people who had known the victim or who simply wanted to see justice done. The testimony was difficult to hear, filled with graphic details of the assault and murder, and more than one person left the courtroom in tears. But there was also a sense of catharsis in seeing the legal process play out, in watching the evidence be presented and the arguments be made. The jury's guilty verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow, and the subsequent recommendation of the death penalty sparked debate about the morality and effectiveness of capital punishment. Some believed it was the only appropriate response to such a heinous crime, while others questioned whether the state had the right to take a life, even in the name of justice. These debates continued long after the trial ended, and they resurfaced each time the case moved through the appeals process and again when the execution date was set. The victim's family, meanwhile, tried to navigate their grief in the public eye. They attended the trial, listened to the testimony, and faced the man accused of killing their daughter. It was an ordeal that no parent should have to endure, but they did so with dignity and strength, determined to see the case through to its conclusion. In the years that followed, they remained relatively private, declining most interview requests and choosing to remember their daughter in their own way. They participated in the scholarship program established in her name, attending the annual award ceremony when they were able, and finding some solace in knowing that her legacy would live on through the students who benefited from the fund. But no amount of public recognition or legal resolution could fill the void left by her absence, and they carried that loss with them every day. The scholarship itself became a meaningful part of the victim's legacy. Each year, a deserving dance student was selected to receive financial support for their education, chosen based on talent, dedication, and a commitment to sharing their love of dance with others. The first recipient was a ballerina who embodied many of the same qualities that had made the victim so beloved, and in presenting the award, the university president spoke about the victim's grace, both on and off the stage. He recalled seeing her perform in a production of a famous ballet the semester before her death, and being struck by the beauty and poise she brought to the role. These memories, shared publicly, helped to humanize the victim beyond the crime that had taken her life, reminding people that she was more than just a name in a case file or a headline in a newspaper. She was a real person with dreams and talents and people who loved her, and that was what mattered most. As the years passed and the appeals process dragged on, the case periodically resurfaced in the news. Each time a court issued a ruling or a new appeal was filed, reporters would revisit the story, reminding the public of what had happened and updating them on the status of the case. These updates kept the memory of the victim alive in the public consciousness, but they also served as a reminder of how slowly the wheels of justice can turn. For those closely connected to the case, the family, the friends, the investigators, each new development was a fresh reminder of the tragedy and the long wait for closure. But they remained patient, trusting that the legal system would ultimately deliver the outcome they believed was just. The final years before the execution were marked by increased media attention and public debate. As the execution date approached, advocacy groups on both sides of the capital punishment debate weighed in, with some arguing that the defendant deserved to die for his crimes, and others contending that the death penalty was inherently unjust. The defendant's claims of innocence, particularly his assertion that his father was the real killer, added another layer of complexity to the discussion. Some people found his story plausible and called for further investigation, while others dismissed it as a last-ditch attempt to avoid responsibility. The courts ultimately sided with the latter view, finding that the DNA evidence and other forensic findings were too strong to be overcome by hearsay and speculation. But the controversy ensured that the case remained in the public eye right up until the moment of execution. On the day of the execution, a small group of protesters gathered outside the prison, some holding signs calling for an end to the death penalty and others demanding justice for the victim. Inside the prison, the execution proceeded according to protocol. The defendant was given a final meal, allowed to make a final statement, and then administered the lethal injection. Witnesses to the execution, including the state attorney general and members of the media, described the process as clinical and unemotional, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos of the crime that had brought the defendant to that moment. When it was over, the official announcement was made, and the news spread quickly through the community and beyond. For many, it marked the end of a long and painful chapter. For others, it raised questions about the nature of justice and whether taking a life, even in response to murder, truly served the cause of healing and closure. In the weeks and months that followed the execution, the community reflected on what the case had meant and what lessons could be drawn from it. There was a renewed appreciation for the work of law enforcement and the importance of forensic science in solving crimes. There was also a recognition of the need for patience and persistence, as the case had taken nearly 3 decades to resolve from crime to execution. Some called for reforms to the appeals process, arguing that it took too long and caused unnecessary suffering for victims' families. Others defended the lengthy process as a necessary safeguard against wrongful convictions, pointing out that the stakes in capital cases are too high to rush to judgment. These debates continued in editorial pages, town hall meetings, and conversations among neighbors, reflecting the deep and often conflicting feelings that the case had stirred. The victim's memory, meanwhile, continued to be honored in quiet and meaningful ways. The scholarship fund grew over the years, supported by donations from alumni, faculty, and community members who wanted to ensure that her legacy would endure. The recipients of the scholarship often spoke about the honor of carrying her name and the responsibility they felt to live up to the standard she had set. The university continued to recognize her contributions to the dance program, and her story became part of the institution's history, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. Friends and former classmates kept her memory alive through personal remembrances, sharing stories and photographs on anniversaries of her birth and death, and finding comfort in the knowledge that she had not been forgotten. For the investigators who worked the case, the resolution brought a sense of professional satisfaction but also a tinge of sadness. They had devoted years of their careers to finding the killer, and when the breakthrough finally came, it was both a triumph and a reminder of how much time had been lost. The detectives who had interviewed witnesses, processed evidence, and followed leads that went nowhere could finally close the file, knowing that they had done their job and delivered justice. But they also knew that no amount of success could undo the harm that had been done or restore what had been taken. The police chief, who had been one of the first responders to the missing persons report, spoke in later interviews about how the case had stayed with him throughout his career, a constant reminder of the stakes involved in law enforcement work and the importance of never giving up on a case, no matter how cold it might seem. The prosecutor who had taken the case to trial and secured the death penalty also reflected on the experience in the years that followed. He spoke about the weight of responsibility that came with seeking capital punishment, the need to be absolutely certain of the defendant's guilt, and the emotional toll of presenting such graphic evidence in court. He expressed confidence in the verdict and the sentence, citing the overwhelming nature of the DNA evidence and the corroborating testimony and forensic findings. But he also acknowledged the human cost of the case, not just for the victim and her family, but for everyone involved, from the jurors who had to hear the details of the crime to the defense attorneys who had to represent a client accused of such horrific acts. It was a reminder that the criminal justice system, for all its processes and procedures, is ultimately made up of people, and those people carry the weight of the decisions they make. The case also had broader implications for how cold cases are handled, and how advances in technology can breathe new life into investigations that might otherwise have been abandoned. In the years since the arrest, law enforcement agencies across the country have increasingly turned to DNA databases and genetic genealogy to solve old cases, and the success in this particular case served as a proof of concept for those methods. It demonstrated that even decades after a crime, it is possible to identify a suspect and bring them to justice, provided that the evidence is properly preserved and that investigators are willing to pursue every available lead. This has led to a renewed focus on cold case units and a greater investment in forensic technology, with the hope that other families who have been waiting for answers might one day receive them. But the case also served as a cautionary tale about the limitations of the justice system and the randomness of fate. The suspect in this case was caught not because of a targeted investigation, but because he was arrested for an unrelated crime and happened to be in the database when the comparison was made. This raises questions about how many other cases might remain unsolved simply because the perpetrators have never been arrested or required to submit DNA samples. It also highlights the importance of expanding databases and ensuring that law enforcement has the tools and resources needed to solve crimes. At the same time, it raises concerns about privacy and the potential for abuse, as the collection and storage of genetic information can have far-reaching implications beyond the criminal justice system. These are complex issues without easy answers, and they continue to be debated by policymakers, legal experts, and civil liberties advocates. In the end, the case of the young dancer who was murdered in the winter of 1996 is a story of tragedy, perseverance, and eventual justice. It is a story about a life cut short, a community shaken, and a legal system that, despite its flaws and delays, ultimately held the guilty party accountable. It is also a story about the power of science, the importance of never giving up, and the enduring impact that one person can have on the lives of others. The victim may be gone, but her memory lives on in the scholarship that bears her name, in the friends and family who continue to honor her, and in the knowledge that her killer was brought to justice. For the community that lived through this ordeal, the resolution of the case was both an ending and a beginning, a chance to finally close a painful chapter and move forward with the lessons learned and the memories preserved. And for the countless other families waiting for answers in their own cold cases, it is a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is not always denied, and that hope, even in the darkest of circumstances, is never entirely lost.